afternoon, everyone. I am Adolfo Carrillo Cabello, and I'm a technology enhanced language learning specialist at the University of Minnesota. And I'm delighted to welcome you to the fourth session of our Fall 2021 series. The Language Collaboratory is a partnership for the advancement of intercollegiate dialogue on the teaching of languages and cultures, driven by language centers and institute at the University of Iowa, the University of Michigan, the University of Minnesota, Michigan State University, and the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Our aim is to provide collaborative professional learning opportunities for educators of language, culture, and literature at the 5 institutions and beyond. Our series this fall aims at furthering conversations on the topic of student engagement. We address this issue from 2 perspectives: 1, research, and 2, pedagogical and practical. We aim to share insights and to encourage interinstitutional dialogue, bridging the institutional distance and fostering a collaborative interchange of ideas. You're invited to contribute to what we hope to be a lively discussion. The session will be recorded and made available through each institution's website. We ask that you mute your microphone at the outset of the session, but you can also use the raise hand feature to contribute and ask your question live when prompted. You can also raise your hand and post your comments in the chat. Today, we're pleased to welcome Professor Julie Sykes from the University of Oregon. Her session is titled Digital Spaces and Games in the Context of Language Teaching and Learning. Before I pass it on to Professor Sykes, I would like to encourage everyone to attend our next session, which will be held next Thursday, October 28th, at the same time. Our discussants from next week are Julie Evershed and Filomena Mission from the University of Michigan. After today's session, you will receive an email to invite you to provide feedback about the today's sessions. Please consider providing your input. We appreciate your feedback. And I will now pass it on to Professor Sykes. Julie, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm just gonna switch the share here in a minute, I think. All righty, there we go. Thank you so much for having me, and a huge amount of gratitude for being here. And what a great group of conversants, and what a great project. I'm looking forward to following the other conversations and joining in the future as I can as well. Also, before I get going, I just want to send a huge thank you to my team here at Castles, the people I get to work with every day, especially Stephanie Knight, our assistant director, who's been a real collaborator and creator of much of the work we're going to look at today. And of course, welcome any conversation and questions. I'm going to be talking and showing you a lot of the things we've been working on, but also welcome you to interrupt or talk, and I'll stick around, of course, for the conversation at the end as well. So the goal today is to really think about games and play and what we can do around the sort of theme of learner engagement. And I want to say one thing is that the assumption I make about language, and I've started sort of preempting most of my talks with this, is that we want to place co-constructed dynamic interaction at the core of language learning and teaching, whether that be interaction with digital content and reading and listening, or with other humans that speak that language. But often I think, and more, we're sort of getting away from this idea, or at least we're trying to come back and figure out what these pieces are looking like. But in that, it means that, yes, there are patterns that we teach. Yes, there are certain grammatical points and lexical items that really matter, but often, and more often, those change in terms of meaning. Those are used differently by different people in different parts of the world. And so just acknowledging that there's a content area, absolutely, and a set of things learners need, but also there's a skill area that becomes just as critical for learning those. And I bring it up especially when talking about games and play, because that's what games are really, really good at. We see lots of cool vocabulary games and those kinds of things, but it might not be the most sufficient in some ways. It's really these complex kind of practicing skills and testing ambiguity, all these different pieces that matter as we look at language learning. And so I thought, as I was thinking about how we would kind of frame our discussion on play and games today, that I would use an old image from some of my kids playing at a children's museum. And I wanted to ask you, what do you see in terms of engagement here? Some of you may have seen this picture long ago. I sort of drug it out of the archives, and you'll see why in a minute. They've informed a lot of my understanding about play. Everyone feel free to unmute or feel free to type it in the chat as we're going here. Yeah, collaboration, absolutely. Choice, colors. Yeah, the colors are great, right? We miss color often. What other kinds of things do we see here? Fun, absolutely. Yeah, different ages. Yeah, of course, right? There's differentiation here. They were pretty little then. Design, yeah, for sure. Absolutely. You've hit on a lot of them. And just for time's sake, I'm going to keep going. But these are the kinds of things I see in terms of learning, right? When we're talking about the real kind of learning that's happening, we have hypothesis testing, right? They have to figure out how to get these gears to spin. Lots of risk taking. They put on those yellow hats without any question. I think now post sort of COVID, that might not even be an available option, but it was no question. They were wearing these costumes around the Children's Museum, no problem, right? They just dove in there. There were no instructions about what to do, no way to sort of scaffold their risk taking. Also, lots of meaningful collaboration. Sometimes that was challenging, sometimes it was really good, maybe both, right? All together. Also, large amounts of playtime. If you've ever gotten kids to try to leave exhibits like this, it can be a real challenge. And so again, time on task, right? When we're likening that to language learning, it really matters. And tons of problem solving, right? All of these pieces, which we know are good for language learning. We know they matter from the beginning levels, from novice level learners all the way through. Lots and lots of data that tells us the more you're able to take risks, the more you're able to tolerate ambiguity, sort of the better language learner you become as you go through these different components. And so as they're getting older, this was a few years ago now, something I noticed about the pandemic, and in our case, knowing a huge kudos to the teachers in my kids' school anyway, but I think we saw this really as people had to rethink pedagogy out in the world. This was true of, lower levels as well as what was happening online in language classes at universities, but we got back to this notion of play. This actually is a look at these are my kids again now a year ago, but this is 4th grade and 1st grade. We have here on the left, right, a simulation where she's trying to survive a lifeboat experience. And so she's having to experiment what can fit on this blanket and entering that into her iPad and taking pictures and all these things around literacy. They read about history of life and what happens at lifeboat rescues and what was happening there. My little one, of course, doing over here on the far right, she's doing a word search, which is really nice for literacy and language. But what was great is she was competing with her grandfather. So they jumped on Zoom. She had to do these for school. And so they had these races as they were going, right, as they were working. And again, large amounts of playtime, lots of fun things happening in this kind of online space. There weren't games per se, but we saw a lot of that in ways that maybe we hadn't seen before. And so it was kind of exciting, regardless of all the complication. And there are all kinds of other challenges associated, of course, what was happening. We could talk about those forever. But then something happened this year. We're back in the classroom, and this was the first week of work that came home. What do you see? We're back in it. We're face to face. We're ready. Everyone's at school. Super exciting. And what happened? Anyone want to comment? I want to mention this is not a critique of what's happening with my teachers. My students my kids' teachers are amazing. But all of a sudden, we went back to what we knew, right? Worksheets, things that have been part of these units and curricula and standards for a long time. And the play is kind of gone, right? My youngest one especially comes home, man, it's so boring these days, Mom. Right. And so I kept thinking, wow, it took sort of a big world event for change to happen. And then we're seeing this absence of play all of a sudden again. And it's like, but we were doing it. It's not, it was happening a year ago. And so what do we do? Certainly there were drills that were happening online and other pieces, but absolutely an integration of play that was different. And so it has sort of reinvigorated my talking about games and play and how we put this. I think something very similar has happened even in college classrooms and college language classrooms. It's like we were doing it, we were online, we were trying all this stuff. And then it was like, oh, phew. And now we're kind of exhausted trying to figure out how to manage both modalities or all 10 modalities, whatever that looks like. And so our work has really come back to, well, how do we then keep doing this in where we're at now, and what does that look like? And just reiterating and rethinking pedagogy in that space, and kind of a focus on three things. One, thinking about what we know about motivation, but not motivation being the reason we do games. I think it's actually the result of good, deep thinking. I think over and over again as humans, and we've seen this in Dan Pink's work around motivation and the economy and getting workers to do things, but it's about autonomy, mastery, and purpose. It's about really engaging with something, right, as you're going through. Also being an active participant in that own learning experience and getting the opportunity to make some choices and do different things with that. And then finally, privileging process. So this idea that we also evaluate the learning process as you're going along, not sort of one proficiency score at the end or one chapter test or one vocabulary list, and really thinking about how we can look at the process as well. And games on play are a really, really good way to do all three of these things. Again, two really key pieces, right? Making students the active agents in their own learning, and in doing so, promoting deep thinking and inquiry. I should note they don't always love it, right? Students aren't always dying to have to dive in and think deeply and think hard about what's happening. Sometimes answering test questions actually can be quite easy, right? Because it's easier in the sense that cognition is different, the types of thinking that has to happen is different, and those pieces. And so for a long time, I've been thinking about sort of games and play and how we can utilize them to get at this kind of pedagogy, this kind of learning that we're looking at, and this kind of reinvigoration as we're going. I'll show you this slide. I've used it before in terms of games. These are the things that I would say games are especially good at, and others would say in the literature around why games and language learning specifically, right? You'll notice that there are a few things there around specific skill sets, but what's really good about games is that they allow us to hypothesis test. They sort of facilitate failure as the teacher, and failure I only mean in terms of failure forward, right? Sort of this notion that you get to try things out, do different things. Also, huge amounts of memorization. We know that that's really, really important, and large amounts of playtime, time on task, right? This sometimes gets couched as addiction, of course, and some of the concerns we have around video games, but also it's directly related, and often in cases of learning, we see this related to students just really diving in. There are many times we're all working really, really hard, and all of a sudden, oh my gosh, 4 hours just passed. What happened? It's when, we find this space. Also, risk-taking, tolerance to ambiguity, problem solving, and probably one of my favorite, and certainly at the core of the type of game I'm going to talk about today, or the two types, are meaningful collaboration, right? Not just sort of putting them in groups and having them talk, but what does it mean to really collaborate as you're working on those particular pieces, right? And so, how do we do that? And what are some examples? The genre of game I have been working with, and our team has been working with over the last 2 or 3 years now, is really mixed reality, which is the notion of using digital and analog, going back to how we live our lives, right? How we have sort of this virtual and this digital combined with hands-on embodied experiences all the time, and creating play-oriented immersive gaming experiences that allow for that, where participants work collaboratively to finish these different scenarios and really unpack what's happening around target language functions. I thought today I would show you a couple examples of the types of experiences. They're not all the same, just like digital games are nowhere near all the same. We have thousands of types, thousands of genres. Some of them are really great for language learning, some of them less so. Not going to talk about all of that today, but if you're looking for a recent summary, John Reinhardt's book on playful and gameful learning is really, really nice kind of summary of those pieces. But one are facilitated experiences, and these are the kinds of experiences we typically think about in classrooms. We think about them being present with teachers there, having a facilitator, having wraparound and reflection. This is a game we built for an intermediate high school Spanish class, where you have to avert disaster by apprehending an art thief while learning Spanish. It focuses on suggestions as the language function, as well as weather and geography and travel, which is the theme of the textbook. It actually accompanies the textbook or can stand alone. It's called Buscando a Guzman. In this case, in phase 1, you have to figure out what is happening. You realize you're a secret agent. Your other agent has been kidnapped. You have to figure out which country to go to. You listen to a listening passage. It's a weather report, and you use augmented reality technology and what we call the Vault Modulator. It's just a free app that's available to interface with this sort of mixed reality experience. And you scan that image, and if it's the correct image, then you figure out where you're supposed to go and what happens next. Once you have done that, then you arrive in Colombia and you have to figure out what has been stolen and what kind of the next steps will be. In doing so, you integrate the digital world. Here we have an Instagram account that we've created. It's fake, of course, but it's there and it works and it's on Instagram. And that goes with these magnets, which are handheld magnets that they have to collaborate and move around to solve a logic puzzle based on different clues. Of course, all of this in the target language. It's about intermediate low proficiency, and they're able to do it with some struggle and some scaffolding, and it's building that they look at this material and say, what are we supposed to do? And it's one of my favorite questions, because the answer can be like, you can do anything you want, right? How do you solve it? What do you do with this? And in doing so, we see them listen over and over and over again to the listening passages. We see them read and dive into the reading that they're working with over and over to find the key clues, to work with them. And also just intense collaboration, right? No, put that here, try this. What are we going to do here? How does that work? Finally, we use virtual reality to explore and get some of the clues you need and some different geographical maps, and you end up apprehending the art thieves at the airport on the airplane, if you do well as you're going along. Again, all designed to sort of test hypotheses. If you get the right answer, great, but if not, there's lots of scaffolding there to make it work. And finally, then a teacher's guide that goes with this game, this mixed reality experience, in which you really dissect some of the key language features, the structures, those kind of things. And these facilitated experiences we found are working, right? The students really like them. They're diving in. We don't have all the data analyzed yet or even collected. We started in March 2020, so you can imagine what that has been like in classrooms. But this facilitated notion of that we can actually create these play experiences in really meaningful ways without a huge amount of technology, though it does take advantage of the ways that we often are using technology, very similarly to how we scan menus now to read on our phone, as opposed to sort of having these physical spaces. Similarly, we just finished a facilitated experience around intercultural communication. I'm not going to talk about that one a ton today, but it's there. It looks at the really key 4 dimensions of pragmatics that we have to understand no matter what language you're working with. So politeness, power, distance, and solidarity. And we're just starting some data looking at how effective is this in teaching those particular skills, and where does that go? In this case, you've crash landed on a planet. You have to interact with different populations of the Biromoxi who live there to activate the power crystals and make your spaceship run again. Each one, of course, is directly tied to those particular dimensions. But the other one I wanted to talk about that I thought was especially relevant to this particular group was the less designed experiences. So I get the huge privilege of getting to work with a team, and we build with graphic design, but it doesn't mean that that's the only place these kind of digital games and what we call mixed reality games can work. This is an example. I'll let you read it while I'm talking, but this is an example of experience, a mixed reality experience that I built for my second language acquisition course. It's undergraduates and graduates as a review for them to dive into the content that we had been working with more deeply. And you can see this was actually built in Google Slides. I created then 10 different Google Slides copies of the same experience, and they worked on them in groups as they were reviewing. It took about 2 hours to create. It utilizes images that are out there, and the principles of play remain the same, which is one of the exciting pieces. In this case, it's the case of the kidnapped colonel. This comes from actually one of the students in the class, but Farmer UN is the leading corn producer in Canvaslandia. We happened to be online at the time. People come from miles around to purchase his corn for all kinds of purposes. Unfortunately, in the middle of the night, his prized starter seeds were stolen, making any future crops impossible. Your job is to figure out who stole the seeds, where they are located. Please help, the seeds must be found. The key here, right, is a playful narrative, a game narrative that requires you to figure it out. That's all the instructions they get. I don't give them, now first do this step, do this step. The idea is utilizing hypothesis testing to try to solve this mystery. In this case, here are your possible suspects. So you have to use the process of elimination. You can see very playful. I often get the question, wait, didn't this seem too elementary? Like, my college students were very excited about this activity. They really, really enjoyed it. And I think they learned a lot as we were practicing. In this case, we're talking about proficiency levels. And so looking at examples of proficiency levels, and they have to figure out which ones they can eliminate based on the proficiency level and the examples they have. There's some pretty straightforward examples, and there are also examples, of course, that are a little trickier. The feedback comes as they're working. They have a cipher where they have to decipher this. So kind of deep reading and thinking about the theories. When they click on a Google Doc, that's how they complete their cipher to figure out which letters go where. And what they have to do is connect theory to description. So, you know, cognitive interactionist theory as composed to what's happening. Sorry, what is that? Let me just 1 second, see what that happened. All right. Good. So they have to kind of figure out what, how that theory then matches and create their cipher. Here they have to eliminate the suspects with the two most correct assertions, and they have to kind of figure out what's right and wrong. And you can see this is really, really deep thinking around these particular issues, right? It's really like, oh, which one is right? Which one is wrong? How do we do those? Finally, this is a styles and strategies page. And so they're trying to figure out, and again, eliminate. And so looking at these different ways of play can really dive into that. Similarly, we have thought about ways that mixed reality can be used to explore place and the notion of what we call pop-up experiences. So facilitated being those that have teachers that have these kind of wraparound pieces, and they have facilitation, you can do reflection. Each of those three examples are that, right? When we don't have the right answer, how do we do that? Pop-up mixed reality games are really about instances and getting the collaboration to happen as they're working with it. And so in this case, this is a mixed reality experience that was created for students. This is K through 5. So we went in this summer and we did a 1-week summer camp around using play and games and makerspace mixed reality to be able to work with games, play, and literacy. And so kindergartners all the way through 5th graders were able to build their own mixed reality experiences as they were working. And they did an amazing job. In this case, you have to have rescue the chickens from before the planet explodes. We have lavas and dinosaurs and different things. But the goal was not only the puzzles that they created, they played a lot, they did a ton of work, and then they wrote their own stories and built their own spaces. Again, this is mixed reality. So they used the app, the modulator that we had created, and they had different codes and ciphers and secret languages as they were working. I thought I would show you this one. This is an example of a cipher that a 3rd grade team built. You can see down here we have letters with different symbols and shapes that are space. If you actually pop the balloons, inside are specific symbols that then can be spread out to form a word. So you unscramble the letters, you figure out, you use the cipher, and it makes a word. So you can see lots of kind of literacy pieces. We're looking at putting this in a language program for a full year now as we go through in their after school program. Another example of them using words and language to create. And it was a pretty exciting kind of pop-up thing that we tried. Finally, event-driven experiences are short-term experiences that happen around events. Some of you may have been and participated. This is one we built for ACTFL when we were in Washington, D.C., looking at rhetoric and untold stories of different neighborhoods and places. Again, very similar. We set up this narrative where you have a place to explore and a place to go, and then you have to figure out, in this case, you're news reporters, and you have to figure out where the language is going. Someone's trying to steal all all of the language. And so first you have to find the 3 locations where the word thieves are expected to attack. You have to avert their traps by uncovering the powers they wish to hide, which are all rhetorical powers. And then you have to use that information to uncover the secret rendezvous. I'll give you just a minute to figure out if you can figure out the puzzle mechanic in this particular intro. Anyone see it right away? All right. Oh, you can't see it. I'm sorry, it's too small. So these are misspellings. And so you have the misspellings. Everyone think, oh, wait, there's a typo in your letter. No, those are there on purpose. They're misspellings designed to, once you uncover that, it gives you a code to unlock the modulator to work with it. Then they use the hidden code that they find. They unlock the mobile app as they're walking around. And this is a map of Washington, D.C. I don't know if anyone recognizes the locations there, but you'll see this is along starting at Ford's Theater. You start here in the north and you go all the way down to the museum. And as they walk around the city of Washington, D.C., they have to solve these different puzzles at different locations. This integrates then with a Instagram account that people are working with, and they have to solve these puzzles using, for example, art from the National Portrait Gallery. These types of experiences are especially good for people working in culture and literature classes because you can utilize language and sort of the advanced level proficiency pieces, but also a number of the folklore stories, the histories that may not get told. Right now we're working on a project called Sight Unseen that takes advantage of this kind of place-based experience where you actually explore different cities and you can stand on one street corner and realize there are 5 or 10 layers of what's happening there as you're going through. Finally, once they've unlocked all of those, they use the real world there. We've made a virtual version of this as well. They use the real world, and as they go through, then they can solve and work together. Finally, we end up the grand finale at the museum, and they can work with those. For time's sake, I'm not going to go through all the design principles that we go, but ultimately the goal is play, getting learners engaged, getting people out in the world, and using these deep critical thinking skills to create conditions of underspecification where you have to figure out what to do in addition to actually doing those. And so I think there's 2 more minutes left, but I will stop there and I can of course elaborate on those in the question or the discussion piece as we go through, and hopefully gives you a sense of the kinds of games that don't require them to be kind of these video game spaces or the other genres of games that we have worked with in the past. So I will stop there. And I can answer any questions as we go. I don't know if there are questions in the chat or things people want me to talk about more.
You can use a raise hand or mute. You can also type your questions in the chat.
How long does it take to design them? Yeah, that's a great question. They're really, really variable. So the Spanish one that we showed you, that one took a while. It was a couple of months of work, but it goes over the course of almost 3 weeks of class time. Not everything, it just is a little bit each day as they're going through. Anyone here who teaches Spanish, I'm happy to send you that. You're welcome to have a sample kit. We're happy to have people using it in classrooms. So that one's available for everyone. Actually, any of the experiences I showed you, happy to send them to you. The one I showed you on second language acquisition took a couple of hours. It really was not a difficult process, which is why I like to include it when we look at these different types of games and ways to build them, because they enable the kind of play experiences where you want to happen without this notion that you have to have design. I think that's one of kind of the barriers often is like, no, these take forever. What do we do? And happy to talk more about how to do that. But yeah, a very small amount of time.
Julia, please go ahead.
Well, thank you so much for your presentation. It was so informative. I'm extremely curious. Well, first, if you wouldn't mind sharing the Spanish one, the Spanish game, I would love to test that out.
Yeah.
But my question was more as how do you get started? I have so many ideas for different games that I've been kind of playing along for months. And I always feel that the technology is the parts that I'm struggling with. Like I don't know much about the technology to put all of these games together. So if you could walk us through a little bit of the process and also the resources that you have available to you.
Yeah, absolutely. So the way to start is to do two things. One, to articulate what learning outcomes you want to learn, which I'm guessing you've already done, and then to come up with a narrative and a story around that. And then we think about ways to create different kind of puzzles or stops along the way that essentially it's using the learning outcomes to create the content of the activity. And the answer to those puzzles are the story things that drive it. So you use the content to do that. And then the way that we have done it is we build the game behavior, we draw it out on paper and pencil so that the tech doesn't get in the way. As I showed you before, that one is just a PowerPoint, and then they have a worksheet that they fill in, right? So the monster one that I showed you, and it's really about the pedagogy and the puzzles to get you started at first. That being said, there is some tech there. The mobile app that we have, it's not quite publicly available yet. We're still working on those pieces, but it is definitely going to be available. I think people can start using it, or if you send me an email separately, I'm happy to share what we have now, just knowing it's not really supported, it's in beta, those kind of things. But that's the best place to start, is a paper and pencil and your learning outcomes. We do some summer workshops on how to design and how to do that work. So happy to share that with this group, if people are interested in, for sure.
Well, thank you so much. Yeah, I will be emailing you for sure.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Happy to.
And we have two more questions, and Julie, one from Jason and another one from May.
Yeah, let's see. Great. Have you explored games modeled on tabletop role-playing games, etc., Dungeons and Dragons? So I haven't done a lot of that work. There's a lot of that work happening. We actually just bought our first set of Dungeons and Dragons. My oldest daughter, she's in 5th grade. Everyone's been talking about it. It's kind of got, it's really, it's clearly a popular game. So we're just starting to dive into that. I think, of course, it has many of the same principles and could be really, really cool. A Castle team member who was with us, Ben Pearson, for a long time, did a lot of the work with analog games, and he was really excited about that work. I think John Reinhardt is actually starting to do some more work with that and his students as well at the University of Arizona. Which game helps students remember English vocabulary more? Well, I think it really depends on what you mean by learning English vocabulary. I think what we know about vocabulary is really knowing words is more than kind of the one-to-one meaning. It's really about how does it connect to other words? Are they able to think about multiple meanings? Can they connect them in groups? And so at first that's memorization, right? Diving in. So even apps like Duolingo can be helpful, although I might argue that that might not be the vocab you want to learn, some of the domain connection and what kind of areas you're interested in, but that can be really helpful when we're talking about those initial memorization stages. Games like this, actually having students build their own games can be one of the most helpful. And so having them think about the words they want people to learn and actually creating puzzles to be able to do that can be one of the key pieces. So hopefully that's helpful in terms of what's out there, probably, depending on different games, but happy to share the ones in English that we have as well.
I actually have a question, Julie, and it's regarding the risk-taking, opportunities for risk-taking. And I'm wondering if you can comment on whether you're seeing, how are you seeing that applied into the remote environment where people need more hand-holding? And I don't know if you're seeing any differences at all, or.
I don't know that I see a huge amount of need to support people while that risk taking is happening. But I don't know that that's different than what we see in face-to-face spaces. I think one of the most challenging aspects of this kind of thinking and the risk taking and the work is ensuring that your students trust that that risk taking isn't going to hurt them, because they have so many case testing where taking a risk gets you a bad grade and it hurts you. We see it over and over. The more high stakes testing we do, for example, the less likely they are to take risks, right? And so for me, that has been the challenge. I don't see it changing, remote versus sort of back to whatever we're doing now or before. I think it's always a challenge, especially in the older sort of college years, is the grade thing is a big deal, and it can be really challenging to both acknowledge that those matter, but also that risk taking is the skill you're facilitating and something that can be evaluated. So for me, it's a lot of work about building trust that I want that to happen and letting them know, like, actually, that's the goal, right? And what do we do with that? I don't know if that answers your question. But.
Yes, it does. I love that. And Julia, I'm going to give a chance to Mona, since you already asked one question, just to have a variety of people. Mona, go ahead.
Okay. Thank you so much, Julie. I really enjoyed your talk. It's very creative. So my question is about memorization. Do you find students resisting it? And how much memorization are you talking about? Thank you.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think we find them resisting it in typical language classes, or the way we see vocabulary lists happen. And then we test on vocabulary, and then, right, we drill vocabulary. And there is a certain, and I would say the resistance comes in the form of studying the night before, right? They study, they take us tests, and then 3 days later, we see very little retention in some cases, right? And so in a way, that's their own form of resistance, right? The words become kind of less important. But what we see in these game experiences, words all of a sudden mean something more, right? So a code word you couldn't get for a long time is like, oh, I'm never going to forget that word, right? And so in doing that, it kind of creates different types of memorization, I guess. Also, what we know is that good games require long amounts of repetition, right? So when you have a lot of play and you have a reason to do that, you just keep doing it over and over again, not because it's fun, actually. It's because you need whatever happens to get to the next step, and you care so much about the next step that you do it. We've been playing Super Mario Brothers as a family, collaborative Super Mario Brothers, and the number of times you restart a level because you did it wrong, right? 20, 30 times sometimes. And so in a way, you're memorizing the steps as you go along to get a little bit further. The same mechanic can be used for language, and that's what's really key.
That's great. And I'm going to stop the recording, and I would like to remind everyone of our next session, which is next Thursday, October 28th. And the topic will be on translation. I hope you can join us, and we'll continue the conversation, but I'll stop the recording for now.